Good morning everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Deborah Anton, I'm the Interim National Data Commissioner and I'm joined today by my colleague Philip Gould, who is the Assistant Secretary in our office. What we're here to do today is take you through the Data Availability and Transparency Bill. But before I get into the details, let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and extend my respect to elders past, present, emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. We're joining you from the land of the Ngunnawal people, and while it may look like we're in a lounge room somewhere, we're actually in a meeting room in the offices of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and we've grabbed a few plants from around the place just to make it look a little bit homey. We've got an hour with you today to take you through a basic overview of the bill, and throughout the course of the morning you can actually ask questions. We'll do about a 15-minute presentation for you. I'll make some opening comments and then I'll get Philip to take you through the more technical details of the bill, and then the focus is really on answering your questions. We're halfway through a process of public consultation on the bill. Now, I know we've given you a lot to get through. This is kind of my slide. I couldn't find a smaller folder to fit it into, so there's a lot of content for you to get through. So today's an important chance to have a conversation and just talk through the most pressing questions for you. We're of course welcoming your submissions, and at the end I'll remind you, if you've got further questions for us that we didn't get to today, you can of course get in touch and we'll absolutely endeavour to answer those for you, because I suspect we're probably not going to get through everything we can today. So let's move on to the next step and begin with the question of why. I think that's always important to start with. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? Well, the lineage of this work goes back to, and let me grab the other prop, this report, the Data Availability and Transparency, Data Availability and Use report by the Productivity Commission. I do think of it as a doorstop report. And I suspect some of you who are on today's webinar will have contributed to the production of that report. And in that report, government asked the Productivity Commission to have a look at what we were doing with Commonwealth data. And they concluded we could be doing more with the data that we've got if we were sharing it more effectively. And from that report came a government response which proposed the development of data sharing legislation and also the establishment of the Office for the National Data Commissioner. Now, when we've got that report, as you can see from the slides, what the bill actually does is it helps us improve service delivery, research and development, program design, as well as putting in place rules for consistent sharing and establishing a National Data Commissioner to oversee that scheme. And that push to do more but also keep it safe, it was a key element of the recommendations from that PC report. They really emphasised this was an important thing to do, but you had to take the public with you and develop trust in that process. So if we can move to the next slide. The work that we've done over the last couple of years is about building a modern data sharing scheme. And it's not just about the legislation, there are multiple elements. In the last couple of years, we've begun with guidance material to help more consistent sharing. We released, I think it was like last year before the election, we released the data sharing principles as a consistent risk management framework. Earlier this year, we released a standard data sharing agreement that we'll use for the legislation, but we'd like people to use ahead of time. And then going through the legislation, we've been looking at both what the safeguards are, what are the rules and controls that we need to have in place, as well as looking at increased authority to share. How can we do more? And you need to combine all those elements, consistent practice, safeguards, and additional permissions in order to modernise and streamline data sharing. If we can go then to the next slide. We're at a really significant milestone, and there've been a few of them along the way, as you can see from the slide. Going from that Productivity Commission report, we released an issues paper, a discussion paper, and now we have in front of you a piece of draft legislation. An explanatory memorandum, which is a legal accompaniment really to the legislation to help you unpack what that means, as a discussion paper, some an additional discussion paper around the rules for accreditation. All of that together is part of our storytelling. Before we talk about the bill, I just wanted to cover one important point, which is the bill itself is principles-based. And we've said that along the way, but now that you can see the bill, I think you probably can understand what I mean. And principles-based legislation starts with the broadest framing, and then details of how things will work are then laid out in rules and in guidance material. So when you read the bill itself, you don't have the complete picture. What we've been working hard to do is to work in parallel to make sure that we're developing the other key elements that tell the most important aspects of that story. So the accreditation paper is one example, and we know we've got more work to do around what does it mean to have public interest, to have ethics guidelines. What do those terms mean? So all of that is our storytelling, and all of that is crafted through a really strong and deep conversation with stakeholders who are both excited about these reforms and also naturally cautious and concerned that we get the controls right. So with that as an opening, I'm going to hand over to Philip, and he's going to take you through the details, and we'll come back, details of the bill really, and we'll come back to questions.
Thank you, Deb. So I'll be talking about what's actually in the bill, what's authorised, and some of the key elements of the bill. Many of you would have spoken to me during roundtables that we've done over the last 2 years. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that with the current health situation. So in lieu of that, we're trying to have a conversation here using these slides in this forum. So I won't talk for as long as you might expect, but hopefully we'll be able to cover some of the key elements of the legislation. So the sentence at the top of this slide really covers the essence of the legislation. We're talking here about the sharing of public sector data. So I'll just quickly unpick what that means. When we're talking about public sector data, we're talking about data that is held by the Commonwealth Government. And when we're talking about sharing of data, it's really important to make the distinction between sharing and open release of data. When we're talking about sharing, we're talking about operating in a safe, enclosed environment where there are controls around who can use the data and for what purposes. So it's really important that we do stress that this legislation is not building a new authorisation for open data. As we've gone through the approach of developing this legislation, as I've said, we've consulted with a lot of people, and we've worked with privacy experts, including commissioning 2 privacy impact assessments. These have been independent privacy impact assessments, which we have published, and one of those is part of the pack that Deb was holding up before. We really encourage people to view these. We've been able to agree in principle to all of the recommendations in those. It's important as well to note at this early stage that the bill is principles-based, so it's not designed in itself to contain all of the important information which is part of the scheme, so it needs to be supported by clear material. And as we go through this conversation today, we'll talk about some of the things that will make up part of that guidance package. If we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the bill creates new roles and responsibilities, and talk about 3 of those key ones which are in these boxes here. So data custodians are key. They're Commonwealth agencies or bodies which hold data, and they control data, and that's important to look at the definition that we've used there. We've chosen that definition after a lot of consultation with experts. These custodians then have to make decisions about when to share data. They can use accredited data service providers who will have skills to act as intermediaries and safely share data. At current, we have a number of agencies or groups inside and outside of government who perform similar services. We're looking to create a system where they are accredited to do so. Importantly, we will also have accredited users, and they're people or organisations who are able to use data which has been shared under this legislation. We are expecting this to include university researchers, government agencies, not-for-profits, as well as businesses. So while we're looking to make the legislation and its benefits available to as many people as possible, we know that we need to have an accreditation system to show that we are putting proper and appropriate safeguards in place. The National Data Commissioner will have oversight of this system and be able to regulate these new entities. Okay, this next slide covers a really important element of the legislation, and it covers the purposes that data can be shared for under this legislation and those which it can't be. So importantly, the legislation allows for sharing of data to provide government services, and that's really important to citizens on a day-to-day basis so that they can have a more convenient and seamless interaction with government. But it's also important that the legislation can be used to inform government policy and programs. This can also mean evaluating the effectiveness of policies so that people know that money is being spent well and that the government is putting effective policies and programs in place. Finally, research and development, which has some interaction with that concept of policy development, but can be a lot broader than that. And we're expecting that universities will take advantage of this legislation and use it to support their research and development. Importantly, there are some precluded purposes for sharing data under this legislation. This is one of the safeguards that we'll talk about. Enforcement-related purposes are not permitted under this legislation, so compliance activities where decisions can be made against individuals will not be covered by this legislation, as will law enforcement purposes. The other important precluded area is national security purposes, and that's something that we've been consistent on throughout the consultation process with this legislation. If we can move to the next slide, please. As I mentioned before, there are a number of safeguards in place to make this legislation effective for sharing data, but also to reassure the public that we're being careful and that appropriate controls are put in place. And these are all listed out here. I won't go through all of them in detail. Would like to have a conversation and take questions rather than me spending the whole time going through this. But I think we've used the language here, layers of defence, which we've drawn from one of our independent privacy impact assessments, which shows that there are a number of different approaches that work together to protect the safety and sharing of data so that it's done in an appropriate manner. Importantly, we have the data sharing principles, which is something that Deb alluded to before, which we released last year, and that really underpins a lot of the work that we're doing here. We also have transparency measures in place so that people can actually see what data is being shared under this legislation and for what purposes, and that really gives citizens an opportunity to see the way government-held data is being used. The other one that I'll draw particular attention to is we also have redress and complaints mechanisms in place so that people can actually approach the Commissioner if things are if they are not happy with the system and the way it's operating. I talked before about the accreditation model, and this slide gives you a bit of a sense of what we're trying to get from this model. And really importantly, up the top, we talk about a consistent and reusable approach to sharing data. We've seen time and time again that in the current model, new arrangements have to be developed every time a new data sharing agreement is put together. This is inefficient. It means that data sharing is slow, and we're not always able to ensure that the best risk management processes are in place. So our legislation will really help standardise that. We believe that the system, as Deb mentioned before, can actually be used outside of the legislation, and that's a really important element of it. We also, as I talked about before, think that transparency and accountability is extremely important. So accredited players in the system will be listed and available for people to look at so they know who's actually participating in the scheme. So that's a really critical element of what we're doing. Also, this system will allow people to be able to see what data is being shared so they know what data is available to being shared. And information can be given to support custodians making good decisions with a properly regulated system. Okay. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I've given you a really, really quick rundown of the legislation and what it's intended to do. We want to keep the conversation going, so we've got an opportunity now to take questions, but this is only a starting point for us. We will continue to talk with people individually. We'll put up an address at the end of this that people can send questions to, so we would like to continue engaging.
Great, thanks Philip. So we'll now move to the question section of today's webinar. You can post questions through Vimeo, and hopefully you're seeing some of the questions that other colleagues are posting. To give you a sense of how this is going to work for Philip and I in the room, we've got our colleagues here and they're going to post questions up for us on a screen, which I'm just going to read off, and then we'll answer those and probably trade that off a little bit just to keep it interesting so it's not a monologue. So let's go to the first question. I'm interested to see if there's been any economic modelling that supports the reforms, for example, its contribution to growth and the economy. Well, we do have, as I mentioned earlier, a very large Productivity Commission report, and they're the economic advisors to government. There was reference in that report to some economic modelling around what are the benefits, but one of the challenges for this is it's about potential. And realising potential depends on changing behaviour and people taking actions. And when we talk about economic benefits of data sharing, it's not just for the government. So it's a really big picture to try and paint in economic modelling. So I would refer back to the PC that does have some cross references and the government response to some of the modelling that was done. But that's not been part of our work. Our work's very much focused on how do we get the right systems in place to encourage more sharing and ensure that that's done safely. All right. Going to the next one. Who or what determines existing data arrangements that work successfully for all participants and therefore do not need accredited access to relevant data? Philip, in his opening comments, talked about data custodians. So data custodians are those people in the Commonwealth who have responsibility for data, and there are existing access mechanisms. The legislation itself is meant as an additional scheme. So those custodians can look at their existing authorisation and decide it's safe to share. If they're concerned or they would like the reassurances provided by the extra governance available through this scheme, then they can choose to share under the Data Availability and Transparency Bill once it's enacted.
Yeah, and we listed actually on one of the earlier slides the fact that there's no compulsion to share data using this legislation. So if existing arrangements are working effectively, then they can continue to do so.
Go to the next question if we can. So do existing microdata release arrangements such as those at the ABS and AIHW come within the scope of the Data Availability and Transparency Bill, or did the existing arrangements remain the same? So in many ways this echoes the question that we've given us, but you used to work at the ABS, so
yeah, absolutely.
Why don't you take that one?
I think the point being existing arrangements which work well can continue to do so, but we've drawn very heavily on the approach taken by the ABS and AIHW for microdata access. The ABS has been using a framework called the 5 Safes for some years to provide safe access to data. We've built on that with the data sharing principles, so we're entirely consistent with that approach.
Great. We can go to the next question, team. I'd like the presentation to cover the provisions for open data that should be considered as part of the sharing process. Well, Philip, you gave a basic outline of, I suppose, the language that we use in terms of open, closed. Do you want to continue that theme?
It's a really interesting question for us. So at present, the government's policy is if it's safe to release data openly, then that should be done. And we're certainly in no way changing that. But what we recognise is that there's a lot of valuable data that is too detailed to be safely released in the open. So our legislation provides a scheme for this regulated, controlled access to data. So that sits alongside the open data agenda, but allows us to make data available to researchers or parts of government that wouldn't otherwise be available if we were relying on open data release as our key mechanism.
And from my perspective, I can see the two processes actually being complementary. If you're coming through the data scheme and asking for access for information, reasonable for the data custodian to look at that as well and ask them and kind of have a think about, could we release this under our existing mechanisms and could we make it open and transparent, and is there value in that? So the role of the Commissioner is also still to champion the release of the open release of data, not just the sharing, but to really regulate that sharing. So it's, in this world, it's a continuum. and where we land on that continuum from fully closed to shared to open is very much a risk assessment. So encouraging people to engage with risk, not just take no risk at all, but take an appropriate risk with guidance, and the data sharing principles that Philip referred to are part of that as well. Let's go to the next question. Is there an opportunity to opt out of having one's data shared? What about opting to have old data about me that is no longer relevant destroyed? There's a lot in that question. So let me unpack it, and this is the challenge of not having the people in the room. So I'll answer this, I think, in a couple of different ways. When people are saying, can I opt out? Part of the concern can be, what if I'm not comfortable with why the data is being shared or the project? And if that's the concern, then my response would be, as part of this legislation, then it will be a requirement that the public, I guess it's the public interest test, actually having a look at project by project, why are we sharing it, what are the benefits? And ultimately, how we're explaining that will be part of a data sharing agreement that will become public knowledge. So it will be entirely transparent what we're doing with that question. Guys, can I just get you to flick back to the question? They've just moved on, and I know this is multi-part, so I want to make sure I just get it right. So one of the reasons can be, I don't like why it's being shared. So there will be transparency about that. The second question, part of that question is about, but what about having old data about me that's no longer relevant, destroyed? And really, I guess this depends on why we're using it. So if we're using data for policy or programs or research, what we're really looking for in the data are patterns. We're not looking at individuals, we're looking for what does a pattern tell us about how effective a policy's been? What does a pattern tell us about how effective really anything's been? It's not about an individual. So if something's out of date, it's going to be noise in a bunch of data that's okay. If it's actually being used for service delivery and the data is out of date, I wanted to just dwell a little bit on how we've enabled data sharing for service delivery in the legislation. We have built into that thing called an exit mechanism. So if data is going to be used for service delivery, it's not going to be used for decision making, which is again why you might be concerned if something was out of date, but it can be used to pre-populate a form. But then you as the individual will still have to say, yes, that's right. So this is a process you might be familiar with from the tax office. So in the ATO, they're grabbing a bunch of data that they have about you, chucking in a form, and then you're still clicking a yeah, that's fine button or making amendments if you don't think that's quite right. So it's the same process here. So that will de-risk anything where there is out-of-date data. It's still really, a lot of it's in the hands of the consumer to say, we're going to take a step from there. If you're actually asking that question, there's another technical angle from a privacy law perspective around opt-out. For those of you that come from that sort of field discipline, people talk about opt-out around the general data protection right that's in the European Union. So our legislation isn't about doing deep reform of privacy law. In fact, there's a separate review coming up about that. So those are questions that no doubt will be contemplated in that. Sorry, that was a long question, but there were multiple parts to it. Can we move to the next one? Can we make it easier for the research community in the health sector to access data safely? And I burbled on, so I'm going to give Philip first hit at this one.
Sure. During our consultations, I would say that one of the largest groups that we've spoken to have been the health research community. So there, I believe, fantastic opportunities for this legislation to make access to data more streamlined for health researchers. So that's one of the key things that we're trying to enable here. At the moment, as I've said, a lot of the systems are quite ad hoc and new processes have to be developed for each new request to data. Sometimes it's found that legislation prevents the sharing of data with these researchers. So I think a lot of the elements that Deb talked about before in terms of having good, consistent governance in place, as well as the authority to share, which our legislation applies, will help a lot here. In terms of ethical requirements for health sharing, I think Deb talked before about public interest, and that's an important question to look at there. We're not specifically looking to override existing ethical requirements. So if universities or researchers are bound by requirements to go through ethics processes, we are not overriding those.
In fact, we'll be looking, that's an important consideration for a data custodian to look at, is have you already gone through an ethics approval process? So it's a useful piece of information to inform a decision. Again, more guidance material will have to come out on that one. So if we can move to the next question. How will users be held to account? So data they request is used for a defined and permitted purpose. Well, as a starting point, the data custodian has to go through an assessment, really, of the data sharing principles. Well, first of all, they've got to work out, is it for a permitted purpose? And then when you actually unpack those data sharing principles, the first one's around the project. Are you asking for the right data? And does it make sense in terms of the question that you're answering? So they will need to have a negotiation with the data custodian to make sure what they're asking for, how they're asking to access it is right. That negotiation then gets put into a data sharing agreement. So that agreement between the two players as to what they're doing. The legislation then expects those users to operate in a way that is consistent with the data sharing agreement. If they don't operate in a way that's consistent with that data sharing agreement, that's where the oversight and the regulatory powers and penalties and that sort of stuff comes in. So there is that backstop if they do the wrong thing. People in the system are able to make a complaint that these people are sharing in the wrong way. And having the commissioner there means that they're able to do an investigation and hold them to account.
One thing I might just add to that at a more technical level is, for those of you who've looked at the data sharing principles, one of those is around the settings in which data is shared, and that provides a really good way of actually making sure that those who are using the data are doing so in a facility where the use is properly monitored and vetted, so that we can put really strong controls in place to do that. The ABS has great history of doing this. They're able to log activity on the system to make sure that people are actually doing the work that they've said that they want to do.
Yeah. Okay, we can move to the next question. How does the legislation address the termination of agreements, and what happens to data and artefacts post-termination? So again, going back to those data sharing principles, there's an aspect of what are the outputs of the project, and part of the negotiation of that data sharing agreement needs to be a conversation about, well, what are you going to extract from it, perhaps for publication, and what are you going to do with the data when you finish with that? The legislation recognises that sometimes you need to be able to still have oversight of projects after they've been concluded, again, to make sure that people have done the right thing. So the oversight of the Commissioner doesn't end at the point that the project ends. So there is the capacity to go back for redress after. But really, the custodian, in the same way that stuff happens now, the custodian and the user will negotiate what's the output, where does it need to reside, and make sure that it's treated in the most appropriate way. Did you want to add?
Yeah, we've seen over the years a lot of interest in creating what people call enduring data assets. So that's where a research data set actually gets more useful over time as it's developed, new data's added, but also researchers become more familiar with it. So we're certainly allowing for that development of enduring data assets, and that was one of the things that the Productivity Commission report was very keen to enable. At the same time, we recognise that there may be particular projects where it is appropriate that the data is only put together for a very short period of time for very specific purposes.
Okay, the next question. Team's bringing it up. Universities are very large organisations, and welcome to those of you who are from universities. Some have semi-autonomous research institutes. Can these apply to be accredited organisations in their own right, accepting the responsibilities of accredited organisations? So I'm going to hand it to you on this one.
Short answer to that question is yes, they can. They obviously need to meet the requirements for accreditation, but we've been quite clear that we're not being particularly limiting in the types of bodies that can apply for accreditation. Rather, we're relying on the accreditation process to ensure that they have the right skills in place to do so safely and effectively. This means that private sector organisations can apply for accreditation as well as university bodies. And we also recognise that a lot of the time it's quite difficult to disentangle a university body from the private sector, given the model that we have at the moment where there's a lot of partnership work going on there. Also making the point while we're here that states and territories have the opportunity to participate in the scheme through accreditation.
Yeah. And I know that question was very much about accreditation. Philip's explained what the legislation does. I would just highlight there is a specific consultation paper on the development of the accreditation scheme, because the legislation outlines it at a very high level, but the next layer of detail will need to be in a subordinate piece of legislative work. So we'd like your input in terms of what those rules might look like and how to make sure that it's most effective for you. So please, in addition to the main legislation, if you're interested in accreditation, do have a look at that and get in touch. That goes for the entire process, but yeah, please give us a call. Oh, sorry, there was an additional, the team just highlighted there is an additional part of that question, which is how much will it cost to apply? Look, that's something that we're still working through. The bill allows for the Commissioner to charge for accreditation, but we haven't worked out what that would need to look like. So more to come on that one. Okay, can we move to the next question, please? What new reporting requirements will arise with this bill? Well, let's unpack that at a few levels. So the bill will establish the Office of the National Data Commissioner, and the legislation requires the Commissioner to produce an annual report to Parliament. So that will mean that there is complete transparency about how the system is operating, and the legislation itself outlines some of the details of what would be included in that annual report. For organisations who are accredited, essentially an accredited user, there will be a register of who are the accredited users, so that information will be in the public domain. And then for those organisations who are entering data sharing agreements, that information will also go up on the public website. So the annual report I see as I guess a chapeau to say how is the system operating, and we know it's going to take time to mature, and that the story we tell in year 1, year 2 and year 3 will be different. But beyond that, the reporting requirements are very much tied to how are you complying with the requirements of the legislation.
And just to add to that as well, people know that we're talking about the data availability and transparency bill here. I think the transparency requirements and the reporting of that information is absolutely critical to what we're trying to achieve with this.
Yeah, great. All right, next question. Does the legislation allow for linkage-capable data to be shared to bridge gaps between federal and state level data? Yes?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the interesting things about the legislation is this provides the authority for the Commonwealth to share its data with states and territories. So we believe that there'll be some fantastic opportunities for the states and territories to buy into this system, to put data sets together that were previously unable to do so.
Yeah, but that, and while the legislation does allow for it, we still need to make sure that there is comfort by the data custodians that that's being done in a safe way, and that's where going through those data sharing principles is important. And we know that people would like to have access to more data than they do now, but we also need to be confident that that's being shared in a way that is safe and is sustainable really in the long term. Okay, moving to the next question. Is the role of the Data Commissioner complementary to the OAIC? So to de-acronise that, we'll have a Data Commissioner, and we'll also have, it was the Office of the Information Commissioner. So Angeline Falk is the Information and Privacy Commissioner, and she wears those two hats, and both are complementary to the National Data Commissioner. This piece of legislation is specifically focused on how do we share data safely. Angeline has an ongoing role in terms of how do we protect privacy. And as Philip mentioned, we've done 2 privacy impact assessments. The reason we've done those is because that's recommended by the Privacy Commissioner as best practice. And we've done a privacy by design approach. And the data we're sharing potentially is sensitive and personal information. So the legislation also contains referral power. So coming back to that question, what if something went wrong? If there is a breach of privacy under our scheme, we're able to refer that to the Privacy Commissioner for investigation. Under the Information Commissioner hat that Angeline wears as well, there are aspects of those roles which are about essentially proactive publishing of government data. So she also has a role to play in terms of that open data release side of things as well. So I do see the roles as complementary, and Angeline and the Office of the Information Commissioner have worked very closely with us on the development of the legislation, and she's part of the NDAC, the National Data Advisory Council, which is supporting me and my office in the work that we're doing. All right, we go to the next question. All right. What is the expectation around and process for university accreditation, given universities already have extensive processes in place for ensuring research is undertaken appropriately? So unpacking that in a couple of ways. So the reason we're looking at doing accreditation, part of the key reason is that people are aware of their obligations under the legislation and they have a tie to it, and they've met a baseline of requirements. When it gets into a specific project, which is I guess the second part of that question, making sure that the research is undertaken appropriately, then that could link back to the ethics requirements and providing evidence to the data custodian. Have you thought about this? But the Commonwealth still needs to take a decision. A data custodian still needs to look at the public interest and say, our job here is to balance risk and opportunity, and have we got that right? So that's still a decision for them. But of course you take into account the work that the research sector's already done. And in fact, a lot of the process of going through those ethics justifications and writing up those proposals is exactly the same evidence that the Commonwealth would look to in terms of forming a decision.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that those processes that are referred to in this question are a key part of determining that an organisation should be accredited. So not asking necessarily for new things to be put in place if rigorous processes are already there, really just demonstrating that they're there.
Yeah, and again, that's the conversation we're trying to sharpen up now in discussion with you through the consultation paper on that accreditation. If we can move to the next question then. How will companies who hold information on Australian citizens be held accountable if their databases become compromised or their data is used by criminal organisations? Will organisations be obliged to report data breaches? So unpacking that a little bit, I think that's a slightly broader question. So let me begin by saying that companies covered by the Privacy Act already have obligations if there is a data breach. Our legislation essentially grabs those obligations and makes sure that any data shared under our legislation is still covered by those requirements, so they still hold. And we've also put in place, we describe it as gap coverage. Like, we still want to know if something's gone wrong with sharing, if something's happened that goes beyond just personal information. So the legislation also asks people to report to the Data Commissioner if data that's not that personal information has been shared as well, because we'd just like to know. In terms of citizen data, again, where the level of detail of data that's held by outside of government in a company would be very much up to a government department making a decision. So in the first instance, my expectation is it's far more likely that the information that would be shared with a company or somebody outside the government would be de-identified data. That is, it's information about people rather than specific details. But of course, they still have to handle it within the controls and be safe and report if they've done the wrong thing. But I do think it's less. This is not about how the private sector is regulated in terms of privacy. This is how is the government sector regulated, and by extension, if we're sharing with them, what are the controls that are in place for that? Yeah. Okay, let's have a look at the next one. Are the proposed changes aligning with internationally recognised framework such as the DATB? Okay, so for those of you not familiar with it, the DATB is the body of knowledge, so data management body of knowledge. This is a really technical framework for data management professionals. I think it's really quite useful. Again, it's another tome that goes into a lot of detail. The opening elements of the DATB are very much about having good governance processes in place. So certainly that's been part of our reading and our thinking and what we've done. So are there challenges aligning that? I think we're all working in parallel. I think we're working kind of in parallel at developing slightly different products, but they can be informed by each other. And I think good practice and the ongoing professionalisation of the data management group is really, really important. And in fact, just earlier this year, David Gruen was announced as the head of the data profession for the Federal Public Service, and within the APS looking to him and really, I guess, a brains trust across the public service about building our capability. All right, let's go to the next question. How will the system be regulated? I guess that's really the National Data Commissioner will be established as the regulator. I have the title of the Interim National Data Commissioner, and I've had that title for 2 years. It's a long time to hold an interim title, and many people ask me, when is that going to disappear? It doesn't disappear until the system becomes law. And we actually have a regulator. So it's the role of the regulator and the commissioner, supported by an office, to actually make decisions about who should be accredited, to prepare that annual report. And in the way that any regulatory organisation does, decide on a regulatory posture. Who are we going to, which for those of you who don't think about regulatory policy much, traditionally begins with how do we educate and provide guidance so people use the system in the right way, moving through then to how could we do audits to make sure people are doing the right thing, and at the other end, if they're not doing the right thing, what are the remediation actions that we need to take, be it suspension of somebody as an accredited user, changing the data sharing arrangements, those sorts of bits and pieces. So there's kind of a broad thing. Now, if the lights in our room are changing, it's because this is live and the blinds have suddenly decided to randomly go up and we're trying to get them back down again. So excuse us if we look a little bit weird for a tick. So let's go to the next question. If R&D will or can be interpreted broadly, how is the commercialisation of shared data or outputs treated? So this really goes to a question, yes, we've had a few vexed conversations about this one, in terms of commercial use. Now, commercial use can actually be in the public interest. It's about carefully defining what that is and thinking that through. So can it and will it be interpreted broadly? My starting point is yes, I believe it should, because I mean, the medical example is in many ways the easiest one to think about. Access to medical data about the unique population of Australians might be useful both to researchers but ultimately to companies who are trying to put a product in the market. Does that have a commercial output? Yes, that's fine. Is that reasonable? Yes, if it's in the public interest, it's fine. But, and this is, I guess, the point, the legislation requires that each project and each set of circumstances is considered individually by the custodian. So while we can talk in generalities about this being possible, we also know that it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. But I would reassure you that a key point, going back to the transparency part of the legislation, is ultimately the data that is being shared and why it's being shared will be made available to the public. So there is that transparency mechanism there, which in itself gives a different form of accountability.
Yeah, look, just adding to that, we've hosted a number of workshops specifically on this topic with data ethicists, consumer rights people, so a range of different people. And the point that Deb makes is really important, that there's, I suppose, that sense of the public interest being served is critical around commercial use of public sector data. There are cases that can be put forward where a product might be commercialised but would clearly be in the public benefit, and that may be more effective medication or something of that nature, that people are very supportive and actually expect government data to be able to be shared for those sorts of purposes. But there are other purposes which certainly go beyond that, where people feel quite uncomfortable, and I think that those transparency mechanisms and the consideration of the public benefit, which are all part of our system, are absolutely critical for making sure that data is being shared for the right purposes.
So the next question we've had is the IIS PIA publicly available? So to decode the acronyms again, both of the privacy impact assessments that we had done to support the development of the legislation are available on the ONDC website.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, let's move to the next question. What visibility will the public have on data sharing activities? And I think we've probably covered that one, I think, reasonably. The data sharing, those people who are participants in the system, they're registered, there will be a register of accredited users and data service providers, and then the data sharing agreements will be available on the website. So how much detail will be on the website is still something that we'll work through with data custodians and through consultation with you guys, but the standard data sharing agreement at the moment is available. Sometimes you might not share all of the information just because you don't of how you're securing the data. So there are circumstances there I think we need to take into account. Next question. Last question, which tells me we're getting close to time. Will the National Data Commissioner compel sharing of data? And the answer is no. My starting point, we're designing a new piece of regulation, and as a public policy person, with regulation what you do is you start with the minimum possible regulation you need to affect a change in behaviour. And the behaviour we're trying to affect here is for the public service to share data, more data, safely. And because that's the basis of sharing, we're leaving it with custodians to make those decisions. Our view is that sharing, I guess in some of the examples we've gone through today, can be complex. The considerations can be quite difficult. You've got to understand what a particular stakeholder group might think or feel about that, and what are the possible controls you can put in place. And that's going to be unique to every situation. So in this iteration of the legislation, the National Data Commissioner cannot override the decision of data custodians. Data custodians are asked to reasonably consider whether they can share, and again, there's going to be that annual report so we can look at trends over time. The legislation really is just one piece of why the legislative authority, I guess, is one reason why a custodian might not be able to share now. But there might be other reasons. Is there a safe environment in which they can share that data? Are they confident making a decision? And going to the safe environment, the legislation allows for data service providers to help custodians, and it might be about giving them that environment to share. If it's about confidence making a decision, the data sharing principles are a way for data custodians to unpack what are the things you need to think about. I've sort of probably made the comment in some of my public presentations before. The PC makes the point the public service is risk averse, and that's something that we need to overcome. I like to think that we're mistake averse. We don't want to get it wrong. But the only way to know that you're not making a mistake is to have a logical way to think through it. So we've given that to the public service in the data sharing principles, and the more that we think and we work with those frameworks, and experienced partners like the ABS who've been working with this framework for quite some time, the better that we all get in terms of developing a shared language and understanding about what we can do, what's possible, how we do it, where we do it. So that's, I guess that answer to the short answer is no. The long answer is, I guess, well, why not? That's not our starting point. The work that we're doing really starting to wrap up is about a journey. we're trying to lift the capability of the public service as we move through this. It's not just about having a piece of legislation, it's having people who are confident about the decisions they're making, who've got a good understanding of the data that they have, who have strong leadership in their organisations. It's developing a shared language. We always start with what do we mean by open, closed and shared, because we didn't have that language 2 years ago, at least not in a consistent way. So this is going to not all just be fixed in 5 minutes, and that's fine. And I actually think that's good. This will be an evolving story over the next 5 to 10 years as the public service comes to terms with the legislation, as researchers come to terms with how to access data under the legislation, and as we develop that collection of guidance material that actually positions everybody to operate from a common and safe place. So that brings us to the end of today's questions. I expect, because I can see my screen, we haven't got to every question that's been posed today, but please pop those into us by email, give us a call. And don't forget, we are inviting public submissions. We are halfway through our public consultation process, and this webinar was about having a conversation once you've probably, we hope, had time to digest that very, very large amount of material we've given you. So public submissions close on the 6th of November. We're of course happy to take early submissions because it means we get more time to read them rather than have them all land in one hit. But again, this has been a really important conversation, and for those of you who are joining us for maybe the third or the fourth time in one of these conversations, I'd really just like to thank you for your support and engagement today. We've been really serious about having a strong co-design process so that this works for all the players in what is a really complex data sharing system. The design is not settled. We're getting closer by having the draft legislation out, but we need your ongoing support and engagement to finish it off. So thanks to Philip for joining me today. Thank you to all those people here, and thank you particularly for my team for all their hard work, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.